Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 53, Future-Proofing Designs, Scale, Sequence, and Execution. Hey, everybody, and you had to hear my own intro music. Sorry, guys. Sometimes you get things set up and you have technical difficulties as you get going, but I wanted something special for you guys to see for season 2. So at least we actually have a little intro going on. We have a little bit more production value, and hopefully we can give you something extra as we keep going. Season 2 should have some new features, should have some new topics, and here's hoping that we get some other technical stuff going on too. If you haven't seen me on the Two Regular Guys podcast, if you haven't seen me on the Half or any other podcast, I've gotten a little bit jealous of everybody having intro music and cool stuff going on, so I had to go ahead and give that a shot. I'll probably play that at the end of the show as well. But today we're going to be talking about future-proofing designs, and there's a few different ways we can take that, certainly. First and foremost, we're certainly going to talk about what we can do to keep our designs that we create or that we have created usable over the long term, and what we can do to kind of keep them safe. I mean, safe in a different kind of way. Certainly, we'll talk maybe a little bit about some of the actual things we should do, like backing up design, stuff like that. But the primary thing we're talking about is scalability. What does it mean for a design to be scalable, and what would we want to do if we're trying to make a design scalable? Also, when should we not scale a design or change a design in that fashion? Also, we're definitely going to talk about some other things around that, like what are we doing with digitize? What are we doing with sequencing? Because depending on your usage, depending on what you intend to use a design for, you might change how you're going to sequence things. And also we'll talk a little about execution. What things are we doing in a design that change what we can do to quote unquote future-proof it? And you're going to see me using a lot of scare quotes today because truthfully, there's not a lot we can do to make a design universal. Certainly we can aim toward a universal sort of design, a sort of execution that is the most usable overall. But the truth of the matter is that true universality of design files for embroidery is just not there. You can't make something universal. What you can do is make something versatile. So we're going to talk about that. It might be a little bit of a shorter show today. This is something that I haven't written on directly, so I might actually be writing an article about this shortly, but I think it touches a lot of things that we want to talk about, both that we have talked about that are in the back catalog that people have asked about, and certainly some things that we're going to talk about again as we go on some deep dives. Like I said previously, people have been asking me over and over for deep dives on fonts. I'm going to talk a little bit about fonts today. I'm going to talk a little bit about lettering today, but the deep dive on fonts is not yet today. We will touch on it though, because a lot of what we're dealing with, we're talking about scalability, certainly lands in the lap of lettering and small lettering. And honestly, there isn't a show where I open up Q&A that someone doesn't say something about small lettering. This morning, Aaron Montgomery and I were on our kind of little talk show we do after Two Regular Guys called The Half that we've been doing. If you've been subscribed to my channel, you've already seen that show come up a couple times. Totally unscripted, but in that totally unscripted show, we started talking about small lettering and what we can do about that. So lettering, definitely something we're going to talk about. We're going to touch on small lettering when we talk about scalability for sure. So first thing I'm going to go ahead and bring up for you guys, just to let you know, I do have a couple of links that I might touch on that we'll discuss. They are also just external extra stuff you can learn from. Got a couple of posts that I've done both on small lettering and fine detail. Also with Madeira, I did a webinar with Madeira, also partnered up with Rich Medcraft, great digitizer himself. So we've been talking about that. And I would say that the small detail stuff there goes into small thread, which we're not going to talk about as much here, but you can get something out of that. We'll discuss that certainly. You're also going to see some stuff about cap designing for caps, and trying to work on sequencing. And because I'm going to talk about cap sequencing, I thought I'd go ahead and let all of that cap design stuff out as well. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the banner for you guys who are looking. You can go ahead and check this out yourself. The links list is on there. The first comment on both of these videos should be that links list. If we talk about things that go outside of the scope and I can link them in, I usually will add them to the links list. It does actually update live when I do this stuff. However, for now, that's the links list. That are some of the things we're going to talk about. And certainly, this is going to be a lot of discussion today, not as many examples maybe visually, but we will talk a bit about all of these things, about cap designs versus flat designs, about what makes something scalable or not scalable, about what kind of decisions you make at different sizes, and what that means to the versatility of a design. So with that, folks, let's go ahead and grab some comments, see who's here, because I always like to say hi to all you guys and say who's here for today. First of all, as you can see, despite my spelling being awful, there is that link. Go ahead if you need something clickable. It is in the comments for the links list. But we have a few people tuning in already. Lisa Wigland says hi. Hi, Lisa. Happy to see you here. Sharon coming in from South Carolina, I believe. Good afternoon, Sharon. Happy to have you here. Cindy King out of Texas. Good afternoon. Apparently very cold from the frosty faces I see there, Cindy. And yeah, I'll say the temperature has dropped in New Mexico quite a bit, so I'm not looking forward to how snowy and awful it's supposed to be for Valentine's Day for us. We also have Jesta coming in from Sweden. Hello. Happy to have you in. Frank from the UK, who is at all the shows today, just listened in. So hopefully we got some good information for you, Frank. Jeff says hello. Jeff Fuller of Embroidery Nerd and M-Nerd and Fuller Works, his own work, Fuller Embroidery Works. Great educator also. He's been doing a lot of cool stuff, doing a lot of videos. And Justin Armenta, also a digitizer from the same group. Nice intro. Thank you, Justin. I hope you guys liked it. You know, hopefully we will do some more stuff. Like I said, today's a little lighter. I had an incredibly busy week, but I want to put some new stuff in there. I'm hoping to have some cool, some specials, some interesting stuff that you guys can have and download and stuff like that. But also, hey, some visual aids, some intros, some fun stuff. I put that intro together myself, though I can't take credit for the music. That was some wonderful public domain stuff from the YouTube archive. DJ Anderson, also educator and digitizer. Great topic today. I'm glad to hear that from you, sir. I'm sure you've got some stuff to add on this. Please feel free in the comments. If you have anything to add about what we're doing with scalability and versatility, please do. Josh says, hey, Josh. John coming in. Happy Friday, Eric. After last week Takeup, this one will be a great addition. You know, we'll see. Like I said, this is a little bit thinner topic where we're going to discuss more than show, but I think this is absolutely interesting stuff to discuss. I think if we hit the top topics, if we hit the pitfalls of working on scalability, if we talk about how to design ahead of time, it can help us to plan for things. And we can also talk about this with customers. Even if you're not a digitizer, if you're hiring this stuff out, discussing the decisions that digitizers make and understanding why and how they make them makes you more able to ask for what you want, what you need down the road, and to understand why sometimes scalability isn't here. So, you know, I think it's a good addition anyway. Mike, absolutely happy to see Mike here, who named the reciprocators, all you guys out there in the Takeup world. Hello, I'm here. I missed you guys, missed you too. Mike, happy to have you back. Bill coming in saying, excellent. I am trying to scale down a design right now, going from a nice sellout on a registered cap at 5.5 inches wide to a 4-inch wide on a sweatshirt. Wow, that has a lot of changes. What kind of changes are we making here? And without preempting and going into what we're discussing today, we can go ahead and add some things about that. Bill is what? He is scaling down. So we've got whatever his smallest element is now going to be much smaller. We're going to have to look at his smallest stitches, see, even if we add maybe some compensation to make up for this, what are your smallest stitches? What are your smallest gaps? We'll talk about that again. So what is executable in the thread and with the thread and needle that you're using? Also, we're going from a smooth fronted cap. Now, certainly some caps can have things like a knit or mesh on the face that may cause some textural issues, but a sweatshirt is certainly thicker, loftier. It's going to need more pull comp to some degree. Very likely it will, depending on the sweatshirt. And we're dealing with something that's more likely to shift in the hoop. Somewhat. I mean, caps are pretty darn shifty, but you're going to see some sinking and some issues with that, and likely some texture and grain, some vertical knit grain going on. So we've got issues. We've got issues with versatility in the material sense with this. So this is the kind of thing where we might want to be checking on how much pull comp we have. Like I said, smallest gaps, especially we're going down. That's going to be the thing. Smallest size stitches, smallest gaps, and we're going to be talking about certainly some textural issues. So we may have to use materials, might have to use some, say, water soluble topping or something to hold something up while we're working, or we may have to change some underlay options. Depends. But yeah, it's an excellent topic. And I think that's one of the things we got to talk about. We will be going there. Lena says, caps, please. Yeah, we'll be talking about caps more. Certainly, if you look at the links in the links list, there's my talking with Madeira on caps, and we had some discussions there. Certainly, it's it's kind of a high level thing. We're not getting down to individual stitches on that, but it is something that we can discuss. Ramona is in also and talking about afternoon, where she's talking about digitizing frequently. She does her own education and digitizing as well. Heather is in. Hi, Heather. Letty. Hi, Letty. Hi from Scotland. Awesome. I don't know if we had Scotland yet. Happy to have you here. Thank you for tuning in. And Mike says, up in Canada, it's been 40 below for a week here. No big deal. For those of us who don't get snow and ice and who are ill prepared for it, it means all sorts of havoc. So glad you're used to it. We are certainly not. Down here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Texas, not so much, though. Up in the foothills where I am, we do get cold. We do get snow. And by the way, Brian Bailey, creator of Embroidery, and this is something that I have to say, me too, since all of this lockdown mess. Unlike designs, I only seem to scale up. Got to work out on that. Yeah, no doubt. Me too, folks. I had scaled down quite a bit, and now I've scaled back up, and it's time for me to work on my own versatility. But hey, I think that's a lot of us now that we've been locked down. So in any case, with that, let's go ahead and start into some of the stuff we're going to discuss here today. Let's talk about what we're talking about, right? First thing is, I'm just going to put it out here. Why do you see me constantly getting my hands out and doing the air quotes to say future proofing? Why do I say future proofing like this? Why do I put scare quotes on it? Future proofing is really not entirely possible. You can't make one embroidery design and expect that it will run equally well on all surfaces at all sizes. It's just not going to happen. We can do some things to make things more versatile, but we can't make something universal. Universal designs don't really exist. And it's why when you see me talk about stock design, something that you're going to find I am covering for Images magazine soon, and you'll be finding that, honestly, if you look at my back catalog, I've talked about it many times. In fact, I believe you look at episode 37 of the show, we talk all about stock designs and scaling, and it's going to be very similar to what we're talking about today, except for we're coming at it from the digitizing side more than the stock design side. The truth of the matter is, though you can aim for a more universal output, you can aim for a target middling material, you're not going to be able to entirely future-proof a design so that it's useful for everything equally. Now, let me clarify that a little bit. The truth of the matter is, you can make a design that will run decently on most stuff. You have a little bit of pull compensation for some stuff, but it's not so much that things look awkwardly heavy or bold, that the strokes look too thick, that the holes close up. But we have a little bit of pull compensation, 0.18, 0.2 on your satin stitches, which is pretty normal for most medium-sized text. Maybe we do that. We have a little bit of compensation. We have a light amount of underlay. Text might have a center run underlay just to keep it out of the worst of the texture. Anything larger, if we get into large satin stitches, or maybe if we have unsupported edges on fill stitches, we go ahead and use an edge run. Fill stitches that may encounter high contrast, we might put ourselves a parallel, or a perpendicular rather, tatami or fill style underlay under these, and that will make things run pretty well in most contrast levels in most situations. But ultimately, you're not going to be able to make it ideal for everything. The thing is, it's not always what we're looking for, and it depends heavily on our usage and our kind of case for how we're going to use things. What I'll say is this: future-proofing is not the term I usually like. I would like to say we want to make designs more versatile, because the chances are if someone comes to you with a massive change in scale or execution, that you're going to have to either redo most of or all of the design, because you're going to make entirely different foundational decisions about how you're going to digitize. The way we handle text at 5 millimeters high is a very different thing than how we handle it at 50 and how we handle it at 200. If we are at a quarter of an inch or 2 inches or 4 inches or 8 inches, we're going to handle that same letter in a very different way, despite the fact that the shape itself hasn't changed. So we can't exactly future-proof. We can, however, think about making these more versatile. What I will say about future-proofing, though, here's the one future-proofing you should all do. Everyone, if you are not backing up your entire library of design files, especially as a digitizer, you absolutely need to take care of that today if you can. It is absolutely worth it to get any one of the cloud-based services. You want to go OneDrive, you want to go Google Drive, you want to go Dropbox, whatever it is, grab that. Do a hard copy backup yourself if you can. I like to keep them in 2 locations at least. And I definitely have cloud backup running, because I don't want to lose any files. The other thing I'm going to tell you about for future proofing is to save versions. Version your files. If you're going to make a massive change to a digitizing file, any file that you are creating, and heck, I would say any editing you're doing, any lettering you're doing where you're going to make massive changes to something, you might want to stop and say, I need to save a version. It's time for me to save an R1, R2 for the different revisions of the file I'm working on. because you can always go back to your old version. You can never reconstruct that thing, and undo, even when you have a great program that has lots of levels of undo and your computer's running great, undo is not the best way to handle this, and you may make changes that make it impossible for you to undo. There are ways and sequences you can get into where you undo and then redo and then undo again, and you've lost steps in between, where if you had something you wanted done differently, you can't retrieve it. So the first kind of future-proofing outside of scalability, outside of versatility, is for me to just remind everybody to back up your files, number one, and when you're making a massive change to something that you think you may want to walk back, when you are experimenting with something, when you're not exactly sure how something is going to work out, go ahead and save yourself a version file. Save your original working file format. Save it as name -R2, R3, R4, whatever works for you, whatever mentally makes sense for you to have those versions. Save out your versions. I know we're not programmers, but the worst thing you can do is mess that up and not have anything when you need it. And I agree with Ramona here. I have 3 backups I run every day. I like redundancies. Yeah, me too. Honestly, I do too. I have, like I said, physical local backups and 2 cloud backups. Now that's crazy town. It's too much. It doesn't need to be like that, but that's the best kind of future proofing you can do. Number one, certainly we're going to talk about designs. I know that's something that's there. That's in the IT world, but what you guys may or may not know about me is I worked a lot of IT as well. I built all the networks and all the websites for just about every job I had before this one. And in all honesty, it's something that people leave behind pretty frequently. People don't think about it all the time. But and by the way, Bill, I love this. This is absolutely the truth. And I will share, I'll tattle on myself about this later. He says, LOL, never name a design final. You'll end up with final 2, final 2, 3, really final 4. And what I'm going to tell you guys is when I was digitizing, I've got some stuff. You'd go back in my original set, like the first digitized designs I did that were very difficult. I did these really big jacket backs for the Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta for Wells Fargo. They had this big stagecoach design, and I had it on a full-size jacket back on a satin jacket, and this was really, really early in my career. I'm using DOS-based QDT software. It has very few controls, can't draw a curve. Editing is very minuscule for that thing. It doesn't work very well. And this thing, by the time I got done, it was full of curse words. And by the way, I only had 8 characters to name anything. This is very, very early. So trust me, the last part, there was final 2. Can you believe it's final? You know, maybe I won't say what word I said to the design, but let's just say it got pretty spicy by the time I got done with that stuff. And yeah, don't name things final. You'll never be right. But hey, final 2 and final 3 and really final. That absolutely happens in the world. Mike says, I live and die in my Dropbox, well worth the money. Absolutely. How much would you spend to not redo something you're missing? So yeah, yes, I know that's not the topic we came here to talk about, but I like to talk about all these different kinds of efficiencies. And I'll say this. The other thing is, for those of you who are digitizers who use more than one system or setup, I have one machine that I use that I generally am doing keyboard and mouse work. And then I have another machine, I have a tablet that I do pen work on, but these are actually 2 computers. They're not one machine. And so I actually have a working folder that is constantly backed up between the 2 machines so that I can pick up my design and work in whichever way suits me best. Now, I know that is a luxury, but let's say you are working from a laptop and working from a desktop. Having that is also incredibly useful. And if you're going to go mobile, having that on your phone or somewhere else where you can bring up design files or show things to potential customers or what have you. I know right now we're not doing in-person meetings generally, but the ability to pull something up on whatever machine you're on and show it to a potential customer, or to bring it up on a machine so you can get it to a machine to stitch, bring it up on whatever computer. That's one thing I also call computers machines, so I get everybody confused. But bring it up on any computer you're at to go ahead and do that. So that's what I'm saying. And by the way, I love this too. Fanny says, every time I watch this class, I learn new things that make me go back and do a revision on a bunch of files. Absolutely, please. Please tell me about what you learned, because that makes me feel better. I like to think that I'm doing something useful here. And Ramona says, I have 2 active workstations and a backup just in case. She really does like redundancies. All right, with that, let's get back into it, guys. The first thing we're going to discuss, and I think it's probably the most important thing here, is scale. Scale is one of the things that causes the most trouble. As Bill said earlier, he's trying to scale down a design from a hat where he's got a lot of horizontal space, not a lot of vertical space, got a lot of horizontal space. And really, this is the thing we're probably going to come up against the most. Most people want to rescale, want to use designs in multiple locations. The classic one is always, like I said, cap to chest is a pretty classic transition that happens. That one's not too bad. Most of the time, you're only going to be going down, 25, 30% at most. That is still outside of what that magic number is, which, by the way, before we get too far on scale, there is no magical percentage that says how much you can or can't scale a design up or down. Yes, people will give it to you. You will find articles where I have told you 15% before you start really checking out what you're doing. The reason I say 15 to 25% or something like that and say 15%'s been mine. I go low. I try and start low. I have people who say 25%. That percentage doesn't really mean a whole lot, because right now, if you have a design with an incredibly small stitch on it, we're talking about a design where the smallest stitch is 0.8 millimeters, something that would totally run, but you've got it, like, let's say we have a satin stitch and the entire satin column is 0.8 millimeters wide. It will run, but it's very small. It's about as fine as you're going to get with 40 weight thread. And if you're on top of texture, you may already be in trouble. Well, if we're talking about that super, super fine stitch, if we scale down even 15%, especially 25%, we are now getting to a point where that's really not going to run whatsoever as a satin stitch. If we go 25% down from that, we go another 0.2 mils in from that, we're at 0.6. We're at almost down to the point where the needle doesn't have enough room to move over. If you're running, say, like a 7511, you aren't almost going to be able to drop that needle again and have it land in another hole. We're getting really, really small movements here. Yes, at the edge of a fill stitch, you'll see very commonly 0.4 millimeter movements, but these things are at the edge of a row of stitching, not meant to be seen, and certainly not wide enough that we'd want to use it for a satin stitch column in most instances, especially if we have any texture under it. So when we're scaling, there is no magic percentage. The only way you can really handle it is by looking at the design itself. The design itself is going to tell us what's possible, because we're going to think about stitch type selection. And it's the same kind of stitch type selection we talk about when we're discussing like art interpretation. How fine a line can be before we want to use straight stitches or manual stitches versus satin stitches. These types of measurements, yes, there are generic measurements we hand out. The thing is, those measurements for what we're expecting, like I said, if we are 0.8 mil wide or above, we're probably going to make a line or a column into a satin stitch of some kind. We may go ahead and use some back stitching or something else between, say, 0.8, 1.5, something like that. We may want to do that for texture or for other reasons, but generally we're going to get up into a satin stitch. Once we are into that satin stitch range, we know that if we keep scaling up, once we get past about 12.4, now we're talking that weird double cycle stitch that's really long and slow on the machines. We may not want to do it, and it may be loopy and loose. So we also know there's an upper range that a satin stitch can be and be viable. Well, when we're talking about scale, that's the thing. Also, let's say that I have a satin stitch. It's really wide. It's still running okay, but it's really wide. And then we scale up 25% from there. Once again, if I've got like an 11 mil satin stitch, that 25% is going to kick me over the 12.4 millimeter limit that makes our machines generally tend to do that long ka-chunk double cycle thing. That's going to cause us to have a slower stitch out, loopier stitches than we would really be happy with. Even though we were just on the border at that 11 millimeters, we were pretty happy with that satin stitch, or at least though it was long, it wasn't incredibly loose and long. So that 25% a lot of people are telling you, it absolutely is based on the stitches that are in front of you. And you have to actually analyze the design and how it's put together in order to understand what you can do for scale. And the thing that we can do with this, though, when we're making our decisions, we can decide these are the shortest stitches I am willing to place in this design. These are the longest stitches I'm willing to place in the design, because I know I'm going to get larger or smaller. It also may change the stitch types we choose to use or the way we choose to execute something, because there's a variability. Though I can tell you most lettering where I've got a 4 millimeter stroke for the lettering stroke, we can talk about that. We're talking the back of an E, an I, a J, something like that, that it's 4 millimeters wide. Most of the time I'm going to be using satin stitch. Can you use a fill to achieve it? Yeah, you probably don't want to do it at 2 mils or at 1 mil wide, but there's this range where well underneath that 10 millimeters where we start thinking about not having a satin, you still could use fill. And there are reasons why you might do that. Or you might decide that if I work on something in a certain fashion, there's a way for me to plug in and out some elements that'll work. So we can make decisions that make scale work better but we are going to have to look at the actual piece of the design itself. There's also some technical considerations I'd like to get to, but the first thing to understand is that there's no magic percentage. And a lot of people say that, but and honestly, I don't see a lot of people saying, hey, in the comments, here's my magical percentage that I think works, but I'll tell you for sure, everybody's heard it. I think that's something that people certainly do. They absolutely are looking for these answers, these pat answers, these numbers, but these numbers don't really mean a whole lot if we aren't looking at the content of the design itself. And I'm going to actually show you some designs in a minute so we can talk about choices that were made. I'm going to go way back into my history, some old designs. They're not the best looking designs on earth, but they do show you some things that will explain why I think that's so important to talk about. But the first thing, before we get there, I want to talk about file types really quickly. There are some things that cause us to have issues if we aren't producing our own file types. The best way we can scale things is if we have native files, right? File types, meaning files that are generated in our digitizing software. Native files are going to allow us to scale and work with them in a way that we can't necessarily work with when we're dealing with stitch files. Native files are object-based. I'm going to talk about that again certainly later, but what this means is this is where we have drawn objects. We have what's like a vector file. If you don't know vector versus raster, vector is like Illustrator, raster is like Photoshop or JPEGs. Vector images, we can scale them infinitely and they stay clean because we actually have points and lines and curves defined that are allowing us to scale these things, and it fills those with color. Well, for native files, of course, we know we are digitizing shapes and we're filling those with stitches according to settings that we preordain as we're creating these things, right? And these settings can be changed. So if we want super versatile files, one of the things we certainly want are native files if we can get them. If and when we can get them, native files are the way to go, and that's going to let us do the most with the design. It also lets us make small changes or alter the actual shapes that are used when we can. So native files are great. Now, can you have other sorts of scaling that work? Absolutely. If your software, the software you're using, has stitch processing, especially like our software has stitch processing that's based on actual stitch points and stitches themselves, when you scale that, you're going to end up with a reprocessing where you can process a fill into a fill that has the same densities, and that's the case. One thing to watch out for processing stitch files is converting to objects from stitch files. Software that converts to objects from stitch files very, very rarely will give you back the objects from the original native file. It will do its best to guess at the objects based on the stitches that are in front of it, but fairly frequently, even when you're using a stitch file that came out of a certain software, when you bring it back in and try and process it to objects, very frequently you'll have things like a fill being made up of multiple slices of fill due to the necessity for the travel back and forth to get in and out of a complex shape. And then you'll end up with a fill in slices. And when you try and scale that, yes, it'll refill with a similar fill, but the chances are that the pattern may be weird, that you may have some artifacts of those individual slices where it used to be one fill object that was drawn by the original digitizer. So can we process stuff? Yes, we can. We can't make changes to the shapes around it. And if we make shapes to something that is from a stitch file, or if we make changes to a stitch file itself, we're going to be probably pulling or lassoing individual stitches or groups of stitches, and it will be more difficult. If you have a chance, native files. So also for yourself, of course, I assume anyone who's digitizing knows this, but if you are not doing this, don't work in scale on your stitch file format. Don't mess around with it after it's a stitch file. Go back to your original native file, make any changes or scalability stuff you want to deal with there. Work on the scale, work on the objects, work on things in your native file, of course, so that it reprocesses and creates stitches based on those shapes you've created. The thing is, we don't always have the shapes we need at different scales. But before we go further on, I definitely have to say, go to native files first, when and if it's possible. When you can get native files, it's like having vector versus raster. It's like having, like I said, SVG or AI or EPS instead of JPEG or PNG. You scale those and the pixels are always pixels. You scale stitch files. Yes, you can reprocess them, but you're not working with the original file. So native files are going to be your best bet, certainly. However, the thing is, no matter what you do, there are choices that are made in the shapes that we draw that are inexorable. They can't be changed. They can't be fixed once we're working with just scaling. We are going to have to think about choices that we made. But certainly, let's go ahead and bring up some of the other things that we would consider, and then I will go back and we're going to show you a couple things in files so we can discuss this further. But the first thing to think about, right, scaling down. Scaling down is pretty frequently the case of what we're doing. A lot of the times we're going from a larger left chest that had a larger vertical aspect down to a hat that has a smaller vertical aspect. So that's scaling down pretty frequently. And often people just want smaller designs. And why, I don't know sometimes, because sometimes I want to tell people, especially in this day and age, if we haven't discussed the handshake distance for a while, let me talk about that. I used to always tell everybody, evaluate your designs and the usefulness of your designs at the handshake distance. Common American handshake before all the things that have happened during the pandemic was 3 to 4 feet. We really wouldn't see a design closer than that most times, especially when we're talking about business to business. We're talking about people who are using these for uniforms, things like that. Handshake distance is going to be 3 to 4 feet, and you're not going to see a design smaller than that. However, now we're talking about judging things from 6 feet away. If we're using them professionally, we're talking about social distancing at 6 feet away. Anything that is smaller than can be read or seen at 6 feet, you should probably evaluate and say, does it work or does it not? But suffice it to say, we're talking about scaling down. When you're scaling down, the thing you really have to look for are your smallest elements, your smallest stitches, and your smallest gaps. If we're talking about small text especially, you have to look at the inside of lowercase letters, the hole on a lowercase e. If we're talking about detail, and we can talk about details and density, it's another thing we're going to discuss. We're talking about the space in between, let's say, blackwork lines or engraving style lines. You're talking about the space between letters. You're talking about the space between objects. And definitely, like I said, small holes in letters, your E, P, B, D, the uppercase A, these small gaps are going to be what you have to evaluate. Once we get down when we're working with the usual garden variety needles and we're on 40 weight thread, once we're down below 0.8 millimeters, we're getting to a point where they're not certain to stay open, not certain to look good. So we want to work with our smallest in element and gap. If the smallest stitches we have are smaller than that 0.8 mil, if they're much smaller, we have little tiny fine satin stitches, we know that if we're going to scale down, we may have issues. We may have to either thicken those things up, and if there are too many details close together, we may have to remove some of the details or alter some of the objects there. We can certainly look at our design before we're creating it. Let's say we're creating for more than one size. We know that we're going to do a small size and a larger size of something. Say we have a left chest and a cap, and we're working it from the get-go. We can stop and say, all right, I'm going to work toward the cap size, and if I want to go slightly larger, say for a left chest, then I'm going to take a look at that design and say, can I go larger with less detail and still have it look decent? Because then it's a matter of adjusting things like pull compensation, push compensation, and fairly minor changes. Whereas going down is usually harder. If we start with more detail and try and shrink it together, we're going to end up with density issues. We're going to end up with things with holes sealing up. We're going to end up with things running together and issues with, instead of registration where things are spread apart or not meeting where they should be, we're going to jam everything too close together and actually have technical issues like thread breaks and things like that, especially if we have very small details, small engraving style design choices, small outlines. Eyes on characters. We've talked about this before. Eyes on people and animals are one of the places where that really becomes clear because people try and draw too much detail into them. So starting from more detail and going smaller is usually the issue there. So smallest element and gap is certainly there, as are details and density. As we get super packed with detail in any kind of design, shrinking that down is going to cause issues with, like I said, things bunching up, items being muddy and not intelligible from each other, places where there are supposed to be gaps not having gaps. And in general, you're also going to get the tone of the design, the overall color of the design may change if we have a lot of outlines where we have, it's essentially 50% density in the outlining or the shading work we've done, but we shrink it down and we've drawn these things manually. If you've drawn them with a straight stitch tool, we're not talking about a fill that's going to regenerate at a density we set. We're talking about lines that we drew. When those lines get closer together, the density will increase. 100%. So scaling down in this case can cause issues. And really working from larger to smaller, those are the things we have to look for. And we know this from text. I mean, I've certainly taught this a million times. I'll show it anyway. Let's bring my other screen up in here just to show something that you've seen from me a million times, but it's something that still maintains the case. For a 40 weight thread, generally we're looking at a 5mm letter. And why am I telling you to go with a 5mm letter? Well, here's the case. We have a stack of these stitches. And you guys have heard me. If you've been with me for a while, you've seen this before, but it's still worth looking at. You have a stack of rows of stitches and gaps. If the thinnest reliable satin is about 1 millimeter, smallest reliable gap is about 0.8 to 1 millimeter, then obviously we have a 5mm stack of these satins and gaps. People will then say, what about 60 weight thread? 60 weight thread is going to give us about a 25% smaller 25% smaller lettering and satins. Problem with it is then we also have to look at our texture. If we're working on something that's heavily textured, we're working on something that's very lofty, things can sink in and cause problems. So the 5mm rule is about where we're going with this. Once we have text down at that size, or imagine, this does not have to be text to work that way. If these were bars on a window, if these were other architectural details on something, invariably, you would end up with these gaps being too small if you go much smaller than this. And I think that's the thing that's fair to say is like, no matter what the details are, we're still dealing with satin stitches of a certain width, fill stitches of a certain size, and gaps between things that have to maintain. And when we are working at the smaller size, we may end up where, especially if we use something like, say, we have a percentage of compensation, that might work. But if we have a fixed number for pull compensation, we may have to go back and look at that fixed number and say, when we shrink down, even in our software, that there may not be scaling happening there. And we might end up with overly compensated stuff when we shrink it down to smaller sizes. If we leave the same amount of compensation, say it's 0.2 mils on either side, you may end up where that's too much at a certain size or too little, depending on how you scale. So these things are still difficult no matter what. These are the same things we have when we're scaling something existing as we would if we are creating it whole cloth. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into a couple comments while I'm here for fun. So I can't take a DST for a hat and blow it up on the machine for a jacket back. Yeah, not on the machine. Even if the machine does processing, and some machines do. But here's the thing. I will say that, except for this. Let's say, and riddle me this here. See what you think about this. If we had a filled letter, something I can show you in a second, a filled letter with a satin stitch border, and it's got about, say, a 50%, maybe a little bit more overlap in all of the right places. So filled letter, satin stitch border, pretty simple shape. You very well might be able to take a piece for a hat and blow it up. DST, I'm going to say probably not. That's a lot to ask of any software to reprocess if we're processing from stitch files. However, if you had, like I said, a bordered collegiate letter that was made of fill with a satin stitch border on it, as long as your satin stitch didn't get above your 12.4 mils or however high you want to get it. I mean, let's say it's 3 on the hat, then we double it, triple it, and we're still at only 9 mils wide. We could conceivably have that thing blow up, and I've done this. When we're dealing with the right kind of art, it's possible. It is possible. So it's something that's kind of, yes, you can, not a DST. But yeah, I always tell people, it's not that simple, folks. It's not that simple. Mike says, I smell a good TikTok here. Yeah, maybe. I would love to blow stuff up and how to run that stuff and say, hey, look at what happens when you blow stuff up. And I'll actually show you something in a second here to talk about it. Jeff says, I don't know how to TikTok. I kind of do. I might try it. Who knows? I've been thinking about doing a series. Now, tell me what you think about this, guys. Would you watch a series of 1-minute videos where I show you how to break apart one letter? Since everybody's asking me how to digitize fonts and wants to talk about it, would you want to see me break apart one letter per minute and try it? Might be fun. Aaron says, I hate when I'm late. I'm sorry. You know what? Don't worry about it ever. Be here when you're here. There's always replay, and the comments are always live. People will answer you later down the road, and Jeff's right. Always replay. And B-Thrash, hello from Somerton, well, South Carolina. Hello, B-Thrash. But yeah, come check in, guys. I mean, that's something that I always think about is how can we present these concepts in a different way that's, accessible for everybody. And I think, yes, some of you guys like to be here with me for an hour like we're going to do today, but sometimes people are not going to be into watching an hour long or an hour and a half or 2 hours of content. So it depends on who you are and how you want to access this. So definitely tell me, would you like shorter shows or some shows where I don't do live interaction, where you get to see just some education? We can always do that stuff. And we might talk about digitizing, talk about some fonts in small breaks like that. I think it's interesting. Ramona brings up another good point here, and I'll go ahead and take my screen down for a second, get me up. I use math to explain to people what happens when you increase or decrease. If they are resizing 50%, for example, I suggest they do the math and see if the stitch count changed to the 50%-ish also. Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, and here's the other thing to think about. Even when we're talking about small percentages, it just depends on what size you're at. What we know, this is the thing. We know we have some fixed limits. It's the stuff that I talked about before. We've got some fixed limits. This is a fairly fixed limit with 4mm or with 5mm lettering and 40 weight thread. That's a safe limit. Don't get me wrong. I actually had a design I pulled up, but the thing is, it looks like absolute hamburger on screen. It runs very well. And I have 3mm letters running in 40 weight thread. The thing is, they're all caps. They are only block letters, no serifs, no extra decoration. And I had to digitize them very much manually with an incredible amount of pull comp. When we're talking about how we're running this stuff, can you make things run in a certain way? Yes. Let me tell you about that design that I did with 3mm lettering done in 40-weight thread. You cannot scale that thing at all. You can't scale it all because I've done manual work that won't scale because I'm using literal manual stitches for some portion of it. The compensation is extreme at that small size because I have a fixed size. What is my fixed unit? My fixed unit is the thickness of the thread. The thickness of the thread and the smallest stitch I can execute by moving the needle, away from the original penetration point. With those two things that are fixed, I'm going to have certain things I can and can't do. If I keep the needle too close when I try and drive a stitch and I drive it right back down almost in the hole that it just came out of, I'm not going to get good stitch formation. It's not going to look good. And I'm probably going to get things like, knots and breaks and such. If I don't respect how thick the thread is and the density that I'm running at, then I'm going to have the satin stitches, the vertical satin stitches, popping too far top and bottom in comparison to horizontal stitches in the same row, because we know that stitches are going to pull in and they're going to push out. If we're looking at an eye, they're pushing out top and bottom and they're pulling in toward the center. We know that. That's pull and push compensation. That's basic stuff. The thing is, when we're at a really small size, the percentage of difference that we get out of push compensation, let's say, is a lot. If it's 0.2 millimeters, well, if my whole thing is 3 millimeters, that's a very different amount of compensation compared to the size of the font itself than it would be if the font was 10, 12, 14 millimeters, and that push compensation is pretty much the same. The amount of push we have is still in that 0.2 range. That means that I'm not going to have a very different look to the end of satin stitch columns as far as measuring from where I want it to be and where I digitize it. I'm stopping short because I know it's going to push out and be a little taller on both sides, but that's a very different thing when you get all the way down to small lettering compared to going up to really big lettering. I don't think I've got an image we can see here, but when we're talking about something like this on a really small letter here, when you look at this digitized here, and it's a 60-weight thread, but when you look at it, it almost looks like a triangle. For those of you who are old enough, it looks like a logo turtle. There we go. Looks like a little tiny triangle with little bitty line legs. But these legs that are here on this design, they go with pull or push compensation and they grow. They grow as we stitch so that they end up looking like legs. In the actual file, they certainly don't. The thing is, if I then scale this up, if I scaled this up 50%, that same amount of growth is what I'm going to see in the legs, and I'm going to need to bring up the center bar on the A if I scale up so that it makes sense, or I'm going to extend the legs so that they extend down to the place they should be. There are certain things that are physical realities of embroidery that don't change with scale. So that's one of the things that we have to deal with. Yes, there is something to the width of a design or the width of a satin stitch, which will change with scale as we get wider and wider. We are seeing changes in pull compensation, but especially in push compensation in the amount that a fill or a satin stitch grows perpendicular to the satin or to the stitch angle. That's how that works. We end up where that doesn't change very much over the scale of design. And so we end up with weird choices there. Plus, we're going to have differences in execution. I talked about the three things we're going to discuss, right? And by the way, yes, I did just drop a logo reference. So yes, I'm a little older. That and I worked, my schools were not exactly the most affluent schools that I went to. We had old machines, and I spent a whole lot of time on old like Apple II machines when they were already passe, writing logo programs, things like that. Let me tell you, I'd rather do what I'm doing now, digitizing by far. But let's talk about the things we were discussing, right? We talked about future-proofing, sure. We talked about scale. Beyond scale, we're talking about sequence, and we'll discuss that again in a second, but that is not as important as scale and execution, right? Scale is really important because scale not only is going to determine, like I said, smallest stitch, largest stitch, or longest stitch, smallest hole, how close design or elements are in the design together. That's certainly a thing. That's an issue. That's something we have to deal with. But the other part is execution. The choices we make when we execute a design are going to change vastly based on scale mostly. But also remember, if we're talking about making a design that's future-proof or versatile, we're also talking about a design that will run potentially on multiple types of material, multiple surfaces, multiple textures. If we're running on different textures, then the case is that we can't necessarily tailor everything to one texture, and that might make it future-proof, but it also makes it less efficient. But when we're talking about execution, I think the more critical thing about execution is actually we're talking about decisions that we make. So let me go ahead and see if I can pull up I had some technical difficulties earlier, but we're going to talk a little bit about some things that we discussed earlier. First thing I'm going to show you, that, guys, though, is an old set of designs, super old set of designs that I did for the Air Force Research Laboratory, right? So let's take a look at this. This, of course, has a left chest and a full back, right? Very simple designs. So you're going to say to me, right, well, there's not going to be a lot to change with these, right? There's not a lot going on. However, what's the difference in scale that we're dealing with? This is about 85 mils. So I'll go ahead and switch to inches for everybody who doesn't know. 3 3/8 roughly on this piece. And then in diameter, this piece here, however, overall 254, we're talking about a 10 inch. We're talking about a overall 10 inch or so. In fact, right on 10 inch design. So we've got a pretty big difference in these designs, right? Immediately, you're going to see some execution differences that I've decided to make about this thing, right? We're talking about execution. What I mean when I say execution, I'll go ahead and bring myself back up for this. When I'm talking about execution in digitizing, especially, I'm discussing the choice of stitch types and sequence. That's part of our execution. The way we decide to draw things, whether or not we remove details, especially when we're talking about really small designs, we often have to remove details that aren't going to run cleanly. And certainly it will make us make different choices about how much fidelity to a design we can have. When we're talking about things like super detailed fonts, sometimes in small designs, especially when we get to the very lowest end of what's possible with embroidery, you frequently have to do things either in this vein of changing a font style to something that works better, a typeface style, to the point of saying you can't have lowercase letters. When we get right down to the smallest part of it and we say this, you want this to be legible, but we're under a certain limit, the lowercase letters are smaller than the uppercase, and we're going to have to set the type in a larger font to make it work, and then you're not going to be able to get what you're looking for scale-wise, especially when you're dealing with something like this. We're dealing with a piece that is set inside of a ring. It has an outward limit. If I make these letters much larger, I'm going to have to deal with the ring. The ring itself will have to get taller, and then if I go in a line wider in any way, shape, or form, I've got this certain amount of gap between the two sides, and I'll go ahead and bring my design back bigger again and say that I've got a certain area between here that will be that same area and has to be dealt with. Eventually, I'm going to close up between the two. And even if I put a separator or something in here, I'm going to change the look of that execution graphically as well. Let me see. I'm going to try and grab a pointer focus for you guys here. I know sometimes I forget to turn this on, but then you can see my cursor when I start illustrating things. But this gap that is in here is fixed inside of that ring. We're captured. And this is frequently where you have these other problems of scale and execution. When we're inside of a badge, when we're inside of a ring on a patch, we only have so much physical space we can use. When we're on a cap and we honestly have a vertical limit to what we can use, we often have to look at the execution there to make scale choices. And in this particular piece, you can see that I've got a vastly different scale. I mean, we're almost like 5x, and we've got a huge scale difference. Not quite. Actually less than that, because I realized I'm at 85, not less, not 65. But yeah, I've got a massive change in scale, right? We're talking a little over 3 inches to 10 inches, we're at 3x. So massive scale change. This is not a very minor thing. The thing is, for this piece, are there things that I could, quote unquote, future-proof? Could I use things twice? Maybe. I could use the outside shapes. It is possible that I could use some portion of the shapes, of the vector shapes that make up the star, the rings. This is possible. The problem is when we get right down to the detail, I'm going to have to make some pretty severe decisions about what I can include, what I can't, and how I can make things run. And you can already see the decisions that I had to make here. Number one, we're looking at that A. There's that triangle A I talked about. Yes, this looks triangular. In fact, you can see there is no difference here. Why is there no difference? Because I know that this satin stitch is going to grow vertically. It's going to push out from here, and I'm going to actually end about here. That's where that satin stitch is going to end. This is going to pull in and be a little thinner, so it won't be in the way. This is going to end a little larger. This satin stitch will get thinner in the vertical dimension because of pull compensation. So this thing, when it runs, is going to actually look like an A. Those legs are going to grow. Now I'm looking at it again. This is a really early design of mine. I can tell you I have some things I would have changed. I would have certainly changed some things about it, but if I look at the way it's executed, certainly we're looking at a very different kind of A where I have expanded this gap as much as I could to try and make that hole keep from closing up. So on this really small size version of it, because this thing started out as a jacket back size piece, this is what we're looking at. We don't have the kind of luxury to have the same shapes. If we go to the full jacket back size, you can see full jacket back size has a normal gap in this A. And you're going to notice it is Arial black. The font is being represented correctly. It's Arial black. You can tell by the way this weird leg is and the weight of the strokes. This is Arial black, 100%. If we go back to this one, this is no longer Arial black. This is a bold block of some kind. It is made manually. It is not going to have the same leg shape. It's not going to have the same way of constructing the R. Also, you'll see how much smaller the gap on the R is here in relation to the full height of the letter. Well, same thing's happening over here. We have a much larger gap compared to the rest of it and a much shorter leg because we just don't have the room to keep that open. So absolutely, I'm making different decisions immediately. Now, this is a huge scale difference. The thing is, this is when people say, "Oh, well, I've got the original file. You can scale it up and scale it down. It's going to format itself." If I scale this thing up, it's going to look terrible. You can see this is the kind of shape I'm going to get. I will have a triangular A. These will be too bold at the full size. They're not going to look the way they should look, whereas they are serviceable at the size that they were stitched. Now, as you can see with the comp in the software, of course, it's going to look a little weird, but you can tell it would open up, it would stay open as it is from the measurements. The thing is, it's certainly not the same as this one. If we look at this one, once again, we have a different lettering style here. They actually had two lettering styles. I look back on it now, and this lettering style was a stock style that was used. And this is, like I said, Arial black and done manually because it was part of kind of the logo type rather than just text. Were I to do this again these days, I think I would have also probably digitized the lettering around here because I'm sure that was also probably Arial black when it first started out. But hey, you're doing things quickly, you're doing things cheaply for production. Sometimes people tell you use this block, and I get it. So I'm not going to argue that. What I will say is certainly you can still see, however, how much different this style is here in comparison to this style where we opened it up. We've made some changes. Even though we're still going lowercase on this, you can see how much closer we are to our borders. Here we have much healthier gaps top and bottom to our ring around the patch edge or around the patch style design edge. If we go back over here to this design and we go to the smaller size of it, you can definitely see that I am tighter all the way around. The gaps are tighter. We are working with a lot less space, and I'm trying to keep in that space as close as I can. So we're already making huge design choices here. If we go back in, we can talk about the execution kind of artistically as well. So if we go zoom in on this thing, we can say I've got this vertical fill that's making up these mountains here. You can see that I've cut this off. It's actually a little heavier, a little thicker here than it would be on the other side. And I've stopped the mountain earlier and kept the smallest stitch to a size that I think is going to run. If we go out here, we get a finer point to it, and we actually have a different stitch angle. We've used a different stitch angle because we're not having as much problem with interaction with the designs behind it, and I don't want to go vertical for that entire piece. I've changed my angles there, but you can also see if I tried to reuse these shapes, well, I've got a completely fine angle here that has maybe a little tilt at this end that I might alter, but it doesn't have that cropped off side that this one does because I've had to thicken all of these areas. I've had to keep these narrow areas a little thicker so that they were running properly. And like I said, certainly I see things I would change now, putting myself on the spot, showing you my old designs as rough, but I will say it still holds out where this was the right choice to run. You can see that this is a thicker bridge here between these two sides than if we go over here to this one. This one is thinner in respect to the rest of the design area. Some things I did get to keep, though. You know, I did get to keep the curved fill that I used here in the sun. I do have satin stitch borders that are here. These gaps could be a little more even. The original art, they weren't awesome either, but I could have fixed that. The thing that you'll see here is I've gone ahead and let them get very close together. They barely have enough room to run apart. Talking with customer about that, that wasn't a big deal. They had just a little bit of sunshine between them, if you want to call it that. There's a little bit of air between those. As they pull apart, they ran just enough to have a small amount of the background showing through. Not a tremendous amount. But honestly, that was something that was within the realm of okay with the customer, because when I spread them apart, they didn't like the look of the spread apart rays in the ZX symbol kind of sun. So they decided they wanted to maintain the look of the overall design more than they wanted to try and get space in between those to run. If it was more important to the customer for there to be space in between those rays, I would have spread them out further, even though it didn't match the original art, so that we could have a gap between those that would run reliably. Other easy things to pick out for design choices. Once we get to this incredibly small size, these stars were not going to render as multiple satin stitch elements, and these were outlined. And yes, despite the fact that these look a little crazy with the pull comp, they did run quite well. And you can see what we've got here. And let me go ahead and grab this and scroll this in manually. What we have here is a multiple satin stitch element. It was done in multiple segments so that we have a nice carved satin, very much like a classic star you would see on a flag. So we've got that lovely multi-angled satin stitch with the carving on top of each other so that we get those elements kind of having some dimension with a nice straight stitch outline that was done on them, and that actually ran and registered very well. But that choice is certainly something you can't make otherwise. The same thing happened here. We had these big, thick beams that were coming out of the center element here with some finer lines in between. Well, once we get down to this incredibly small size here, these are all going to be rendered with manual stitches. Once again, they were more concerned about the overall look than having these stay separate, but using the manual stitches made them stay separate enough that you could still get the idea of what it was. And down here, we went ahead and used, once again, straight and manual stitch stars because we wanted to have individual rays that were visible at the finished size. So these are all choices that are made when we're talking about scale. Can we do things to make things more versatile or future-proof? We could. In the case of something that is this far different between the two, we're not going to be able to render them perfectly at both sizes and get everything we want. We're not going to get everything we need out of that. It's just the truth of how that's going to work. Now, I know that's not exactly what everybody would like to see, but it is one of the things that we have to worry about. So certainly that's one of the things that you have to look at when we're talking about scale is what is possible. Now, certainly, let's bring up a couple things about fonts. B-Thrash says, with small quarter-inch letters, I digitized a simple run underlay and then a 1.5 mil column. I've never met a quarter-inch font that sewed very well. I have some that certainly do sew well. Having a simple underlay like that manually is certainly helpful. I think that some people will preach to you more underlay with less coverage. I've done that. I've done both the more underlay, less top stitching, and almost no underlay and top stitching at normal densities, and both have their merits. Personally, I'm more likely to do something like this. Even if your software doesn't have a center run underlay, you can also set your edge run insets deeper and have that be pretty decent. But honestly, when you're going really, really small, and especially if you're going smaller than that quarter-inch letter, you're going much smaller, you're going down below the 5 millimeter set. So we're below 0.2 inches. Then you're going to certainly think about doing manual underlay and also having connected underlay where you're underlaying an entire letter at one go. The thing about that is, once again, we're doing something manually. When you scale manual things, they stay at the same thickness, they stay at the same setup, and they may not be equally good. Center run's pretty great because it's still running down the center of the design or of the satin column, but it's something you have to think about when you're doing anything that's going to be exposed that's done with manual stitching. So yeah, that's true. And then Fanny says, how would you manually digitize a font? It will scale up or down. Is there a technique? Certainly there is. Certainly there is. There are some assumptions you have to make for that, and we'll talk about that briefly. There are some assumptions you have to make about maximum and minimum size. And this is how we get into how we're looking to make something versatile. And we'll talk about sequencing in just a second, but let's talk about scale and size first. You guys saw in my, in the brand banner that I put up, I'll go ahead and throw this up again real quick. This is what I showed you. You'll see that there's the that scaled E there and a couple different methods. It's actually from a font that I'm creating for myself. And in this font, you can see that we have some elements that are interesting that cause some issues when we're talking about making it scalable. And I'm going to show you the entire font, right? This is the entire font. Without belaboring it, yes, it's not done, but this is the entire font and what we're essentially working with. But when we go to the original shapes, we have all these little bitty spurs and elements. It's something I talked about previously in a different context that are going to set some of our limits. And you can actually see what I've done is that these are actually larger than the spurs would have been. If I take this S out of here and we look at the original design, and we're going to go ahead and zoom in on that, what you can see is I've got this fine point that also has a little bit of a shallow curve into it that causes some issues with filling. Rather than try and have this fill as one object or try and tail back into it, I've used two objects, and you're also going to see this. I've decided to make that a little bit thicker. It doesn't seem like it's super thick, but because of both the angle that I've executed the end of the satin stitch at, right? I have this angle that I've executed at, so this is the length of my stitch. Rather than going straight across, which I could have, that would have shortened the stitch. I have lengthened the stitch by stopping at an angle here, and I've made this entire spur a little thicker. Why did I do that? Well, I did that because what I want ultimately is to be able to work at multiple scales, right? And we're certainly going to show you where at the largest scale here, I'm showing you a different method of executing it entirely, because I think that we get to this point, and I would say even down to this size, where it's arguable if you want to continue to use the same shapes. It's very much arguable, even in something as simple as a letter. But what you can see is I digitize at about this size here, right? This is about 14 mils. That's close to the size that I digitized at. And in that size, it makes sense that we've got these stitches that are not incredibly short. And I will zoom in even further. This is the size I'm working at when I'm digitizing. Well, if I grab myself a ruler on this one and I go ahead and measure that, I grab the ruler tool here. It looks like my machine may be kind of locking up. So sorry about that, guys. If you look at the design on that size, it's actually not incredibly small here. We're talking about 1.1 mils, right? The thing is, when I zoom down over here and you look at this piece, if I assume that people are going to use a little bit of pull compensation, which they should, if they use about between 0.1 and 0.2 mils of pull compensation, then I'm going to still have about 1.1 mils as my smallest stitch. And you can see I'm thinking about my smallest size. In this case, it's 5 millimeters. That's the smallest size I want this thing to run. Well, I've planned ahead with my scaling and with my understanding of what I'm going to add as far as pull compensation goes and recommend to the end user for this being imminently scalable. A font made for a native, execution, something that scales, for it to be imminently scalable, you want to understand how small you intend it to go, how large you intend it to go, and make choices based on that. So the technique here is this. I'm looking at my smallest point that I'm going to draw this to, my smallest stitch, and I'm making choices so that at the smallest size, with reasonable compensation, my smallest stitch is one that I think will be executable. And in this case, I'm hoping that we can get 5 millimeters out of this design, or out of these designs, these glyphs, for anyone who's running this thing with 40 weight thread, 7511, or maybe a little bit smaller needle. And in that case, you can see with the comp on, I've got about 1 millimeter here. I've got a nice, safe, smallest stitch. If I look at my gap here, I'm going to be larger than that for sure. I'm going to be like 1.1 mil gaps between the strokes. With that, I know that I have safe sizes, and I know that if you run that thing all the way down to that 5 millimeter size, you're going to end up with a decent looking piece. It's not going to look bad. So I'm using the angle, I'm using the thickness of the stroke to establish my smallest stitch and my smallest gap that I'm willing to stitch. And this is the same with designs. You can do this with designs the same way. If you are looking at elements, even if you're looking at an object that you're trying to digitize, when we get to fine points, look at, can I lengthen an angle without it getting too loose or loopy or having a rough edge on it? So instead of having perpendicular stitch angles on satin, can I lean into the end of something? Can I let that out a little bit? If it has a curved end, and that's something we can talk about here, if it has a curve or a shape on it, the original piece had this curve, can I eliminate the curve and crop it, cut it off, and at smaller sizes, will that look okay? At most of the sizes that I intend to use will it look okay, so that I don't end up with an extra little small stitch here that I don't want? These are things we can plan ahead for. And like I said, the way we're handling this is the same way we'd handle any sort of scaling when we're future-proofing. We're going to look at smallest element and gap, smallest stitch, and we're going to look eventually at longest stitch and what's safe there. And of course, what we can look at as a corollary to that is, how is this going to look if we apply different stitch types to it? So when we're talking about scalability and future proofing, that's what we're really thinking about. What's the smallest stitch we're going to eventually execute? What's reasonable? Also, if we're releasing this to someone else to use at different sizes, as you do with a font, which, like I said, we're going to do more deep dives on fonts. I know I'm going pretty heavy on fonts right now, but it really is, even when I talk about scalability, the questions that I've been asked in the last week or so, when people are talking about scaling designs, invariably we get down to text. Like I said, we will talk more about fonts. We will discuss breaking up fonts and maybe even go some more deep dive stuff. But in this case, I'm going to recommend a minimum size. Some software, like our software, you can actually set a minimum size, and there's a little bit of fudge room beyond that. But you can set a minimum size, and the reason the minimum size is set is to keep people from lumping everything down into a tiny size and crushing it and just ramming a bunch of thread together and causing issues. But even if you can't set a minimum size, you can give minimum and maximum recommendations. And if you look at software that has built-in fonts, you look at people who are giving you scalable object-based fonts, they're going to give you a minimum and maximum that they're expecting something to run. They do have suggested minimums and maximums, and people are going to talk about that. The other thing you have to realize is that some things will have to change, even if we can leave the shapes alone. In this case, I'm optimizing the shapes so that I'm getting as much of the character of the font, of the typeface as I can. I'm getting the look of these curves and loops. I'm getting the look of this spur without having the technical problems that the actual shape can bring. If we look at this piece, which is done as a bordered fill, it's done as a fill stitch with a satin border around it. And this was just done to illustrate what I would do when I finally got up to a large enough size that I didn't like these shapes. I would use the original vector-based art that I was working from. And you can see I've got these curves. In this area, I have these curves. I have a curve here. I have a little hollow curve here. I have this tapering to this end, which I don't have here. The thing is, at just about any size up to maybe here, at the normal size we're going to run, the intended couple of sizes, smaller, which is going to happen for very small lettering and personalization, maybe larger for single names, maybe larger for company names, anything like that where we don't have too many letters together. It's not a full name. It's not first and last. And then we start going larger into maybe jacket back names. These still look pretty good. These are not really suffering too much from the changes that were made. Once we get to the point where we have a single letter that's really large, we're dealing with big Jersey names where you only have, say, 4 letters. We have the name Hill, and it has to be 10 inches across the back of the shoulders of some design. We're going to end up wanting to probably change that to a different stitch type, and then the execution we've done maybe not what we want it to be to maintain the character anymore. So what we're really looking for is what is that smallest element and how can we minimize the problems that we're going to have technically with what the smallest stitch and the smallest gap can be. And we're looking at the largest stitch and what that does when we just change stitch type. Because as you can see, as we get up to a certain size, right here, we're still on the border, right? If I look at this piece right here, we're still kind of on the border as to satin stitch being okay. It's not great. These are 10 mm blocks right here. These are centimeters. So if we go through here, we're getting a pretty long stitch in that corner. We're probably not very happy with how that turns out. At this point, we're at 13 mils. We're definitely going to be hearing that good chunk. This is going to be too wide. I probably should already break this down. And depending on your software, it may even automatically flip when it gets to a certain size. Here, over on this side, what you're seeing is that I actually have a length limited stitch. Some people have a flexi split. You may have a auto split. There's different ways that this can be called, but ultimately this piece over here is definitely a different setup. This piece over here is more of a patterned stitch. What I have is a length limited stitch or a split that has a nice satin-like edge because I've inset it. I have a gap between the edge where I don't allow any stitch penetrations to land, and then I have some patterning in here, but these are nice long stitches so that they maintain some shine, and they don't end up having kind of a pattern very much like a tatami stitch. They look more like a satin than they do a tatami, but they break up the super long lines so I don't have long loopy stitches. I think at this size, we're already getting a little too big for that. I should probably have the length limit down to this size. And here, I'm probably already looking at something that's a little too big, and we don't really want a satin type look anymore at this 4.5 inch tall piece. And with a really broad, thick font like this, we might not want that look. We might already want to go to fill stitches. And I'll be honest with you, I do not love doing a full-on fill stitch with turning angles the way a satin is done. It is not my favorite look. I don't love it. By the time I'm up to a piece where I think I really need a fill stitch, I'm probably going to want to unify all those objects or go back to the original art and do this. I'm going to want to do a fully filled area that has borders. I'm probably going to say that the texture of the satin stitch elements breaking up isn't as important anymore by the time I have a big full fill. And honestly, at this size, I'm even looking at applique. I'm looking at other object-based ways to handle this. I'm not going to maybe scale it the same way. So if we were going from size to size like that, I'm going to say by the time I get out to this ultimate end where I'm at, these 8-inch tall letters, I'm not trying to maintain these shapes anymore. These shapes are not intended for that. So you have a smallest range, you have a largest range. And I think that's the same with the designs here. If we were talking about this design here, I could absolutely scale that up 25%, and I think it'd still be okay. It wouldn't be perfect. It'd be okay. I'd have to do a little bit of tweaking for pull compensation, and it'd probably be all right. Wouldn't be the best, would probably be okay. If I'm talking about this jacket back piece here, it's already made really large. Everything has been done in such a way where you could scale it up quite a bit and you could scale it down quite a bit and still be okay. You'd be within the realm of usable stitching, right? The only thing I'd look for here if I scaled it up is I would look at my longest satin stitches, probably in here in this taper, where we have a mitered corner. I'd look at the longest satins and say, am I getting to the point where they're ridiculously loose and loopy? Does it still make sense? I'd look at the corners and all my lettering to see if we had really long stitches are going to look loopy. But the thing is, you can future-proof to a degree by having a couple of sizes that you may shrink or grow a small amount in order to get those to work for a couple uses. You can have a left chest / hat, and then you can have a jacket back / front, like say a sweatshirt front, which is often a little bit smaller than a jacket back. You could probably get away with that on simple designs that don't have a lot of incredible detail. I mean, not everything's going to work. Not all designs are going to work. It's like I've talked about before, where we have straight stitch details. Anytime you have something like a little star like this, where we have straight stitch details, we have this person who is looking through some binoculars and has a little tiny eye that's made of 5 stitches. If I scale this up very much, these lines, these straight stitch lines, which look fine at size, they're going to look sparse. They're going to look too thin because a line of like 2 rows of straight stitches on top of each other are going to be the same thickness when you scale it up. Satin stitches will get thicker. They won't. The problem we'll have with this is we've made a font choice where we're using in-column serifs. They're in the same angle as the column, and these are very wide. We can see that the end stitches that make the serifs up on this patch were very wide. And if they're very wide, these are then going to, as we scale up, get long and loose and loopy and look disconnected from the rest of the font. We may have to replace the font. Now, if we've used a built-in scalable font or something we can replace with something else and it's close and it's something that's okay with our customer, it's not custom text, or it's not part of a logo type, which we should never replace the stock standard fonts, in my opinion, then this could probably be replaced. We could, like this right here, this is a small Roman style serif font, like a Times. It's made to be small. It is tweaked so that it works at small sizes. It has those in-column serifs. If we scaled this piece up quite a bit, and let's say we went back and reworked parts of the face, the fill stitches probably work. A lot of the satins that were in here would probably work scaled up. The straight stitch details would not. We would have to alter the compensation and the shapes for some of the stuff that are happening in these stars as well, and these also. You can see that these have they actually have a small underlay point that's sent outside of this edge of the point. There's a small stitch coming out of the center that is made to help these look more sharp when they run. The columns push out to the end, and that one little point makes the stars look very sharp. But that's something that might not look good as you scale it up. There are certain things you would have to replace. So could we future-proof it a little bit? Perhaps. The thing is, if I want to take that to a jacket back size now, we're not going to manage it. And even if we did, if we used certain elements, if we used the curved fills, if we used the rest of the fill areas, the borders, we're probably going to make some adjustments to it. And the likelihood is we'll be replacing all of the text whole cloth and replacing all of the detail work as well. So it really just depends on the elements that are there, what's scalable and what's possible. Let me check out whatever comments. You guys have a couple of comments that I haven't seen yet because I've been working outside of the comments for a section. But let's just go ahead and see what else is going on here. Certainly we have Jarita saying, made it here, had an appointment. Glad you're here, Jarita. Thank you for being here. I know you've been working on some awesome landscape stuff. Good to see you. And Julie says, hello from really cold Wisconsin. I've got family up in Wisconsin. And hello, Julie. Hopefully you are taking care and keeping warm enough. So what are the things that we talked about? Let's go back one more time and discuss the kind of items we were going to discuss. Certainly scale. Scale's been the biggest thing about future-proofing. How do we future-proof a design? Well, the first thing is we make sure we're working at a scale that is close to our finished size as we can. If we're going to have vastly different finished sizes, the chances are, unless we keep our elements very simple, we reduce any sort of manual detail work, the chances are we're going to have to rework them. Certainly, we want to think about the effects of pull and push compensation and how those are going to change and what we'll have to do to alter things. So one of the things we can do is to look at those elements and say, what's our smallest stitch, smallest gap? What's our largest stitch? What are our longest stitches going to be? And what does that mean to the way the design is going to run? So we can use that. Scale is important. Certainly, we talked about execution. We want to choose stitch types that scale well, and we want to look at the things like the longest stitches. If we use a corner on a letter or on a border in satin stitch, when we have a full 45-degree angle, we've got an incredible length across there. As we scale up, that's where those long stitches are going to be. If we used mitered corners, we might actually get more mileage out of that, but then it does change the look and the execution. You can do things that make things more scalable. If you eliminate or change the way we execute so we don't have the longest stitches, the shortest stitches, we can change how scalable something is, hence why the fonts work that way. if we make sure we're thinking about the smallest executable size for the font, we can look at the smallest stitch that we're making and we can decide that smallest stitch, I'm going to lengthen it, I'm going to change the look of some elements slightly so that at the smallest size it works, at the size that I intended it works, and still captures that look. And even at a size larger than that, it still looks okay, even if it doesn't maintain all of the curvature, all of the shape of the original piece. We can execute that way. Certainly, we can make sure we have our native files. We can make sure that we have our working file so that certain things that need to be changed, like underlay types, like underlay settings, like compensation settings, can be done with numbers, that we can adjust things. Honestly, I draw for the compensation I need. I draw overlaps in that I need, and then I use things like compensation numbers, percentages, point values to tweak when I have to work on either different scales or different materials that end up requiring more compensation. When we go from something super flat that doesn't have a lot of pull, it doesn't sink in, to something that is super lofty and thick, and where satin stitches or any stitch will really sink in and get very small, get narrower, I'm going to be able to add compensation with the software compensation. Whereas the borders, the overlaps, I'm generally going to tend to draw in a certain amount of compensation to start. And then I'm going to use those numbers to compensate after. I'm not going to draw vector perfect shapes that look like they should for print, where items just meet, and then use the pull compensation numbers to get overlaps where I need them. I'm going to draw overlaps in. I'm going to sequence in such a way where things belong on top that are supposed to be on top, or occluding, covering something else. And I'm going to then use the compensation numbers to get closer when I have to make a change, when I have to scale, when I have to use something on material that doesn't behave the same way as the original material I chose. So that's the other thing we need to future-proof, is to work that way, to draw the shapes we need and to compensate into the issues that come up from scale, from objects, from materials. But then the last one here that I want to discuss briefly is sequence. And I'll show you a piece that I was going to show you guys for the border setup. And yes, THCU means about what you think it is. And yes, that is a marijuana leaf in the corner. So I'll just say this: when Colorado was undergoing its boom, working in New Mexico means that I did a bunch of stuff for weed companies at the company I was at. That's up to you whether or not you like the marijuana or the medical marijuana or recreational marijuana scene. That's something I didn't make a choice about. That was something where in the work that I did, I was stitching out a bunch of marijuana related stuff. So yes, THCU actually stands, I believe, for Trinidad Higher Calling University, something like that. But yes, it was a place related to the growing of marijuana. However, the thing that's interesting about this is that we have a sequence here that is made for caps. Fairly invisible because everything's connected. They were going on caps that were shifting quite a lot, and we had a couple different types of caps we were running, and we were seeing a lot of shifting, a lot of movement in the actual stitch out. So I went ahead and decided to center this thing out and to do some individual work on borders as I stitched out to keep it stable. The thing is, you can run this on a flat just fine. The sequencing that I did didn't cause this to not work on shirts, not work on a jacket, but the thing is, it does work on hats. If you have to run on multiple garments and you're not expecting to do this over and over and over again, because there's always the problem with efficiency. This is an inefficient design that runs very well on shifty caps that you can run on a flat garment, you can run on a jacket, you can run on a shirt. And I'll go ahead and run it through its sequence real quick so you can see it. So I'm running the letter center out, as you can see. We're running this white first, and then of course we have the leaf detail that's here, and it's actually got a jump that it shouldn't have in it. But this is one of my old working files. I didn't really check to see if I was on the last version. And then we have some border work that is done largely centered out best as we can. As you can see, it's broken up, run from the center out, overlapping in a way that makes sense. And then I actually ran the borders where I finished each border separately because we were seeing a lot of shifting in the final part of the run. And we jumped from one side back to the other. The issue with that is if we're doing this on thousands of garments, if we're doing it on shirts, this is super inefficient because I don't need to be this careful about the sequence on a shirt. It means that I'm doing a lot more jumping, a lot more trimming, and I'm wasting a lot of stitches and movement. And the least movement we can get out of our machine while we are stitching is probably the best. That's really going to be the least travel. Also, honestly, the less time that I'm jumping where I don't have my needle running is going to be the best. I shouldn't have as many jumps and trims as this if I were doing this for flats. For caps, it made sense. It was helping to stabilize some really shifty materials and some caps that were not holding together very well on the machines. The thing is, Can you run this on shirts? Yes. Let's say that mostly what you do for a said company, for a THCU here, are caps. You almost entirely do caps, and once in a blue moon, they throw a jacket at you. Running this design on the jacket is not going to cause a tremendous amount of trouble. This will run perfectly fine on the jacket, will run fine on a shirt. I can certainly look at densities, things like that, and make sure that this makes sense for the kind of shirt they have. I may have to make some accommodations if they use some really out there performance materials that are really stretchy or cause some other issues. But generally, it's going to run on a flat just fine. If I choose the cap sequence, then I know it's going to work well on caps, probably work okay on shirts. However, on the kind of caps they were using, if I had run this thing left to right entirely, it would have caused waves and rippling and bulging and problems. With sequence, future-proofing in this case for this particular customer means that I'm going to favor the cap design and say, okay, a little less efficient on shirts, a little less efficient on jackets, but I'm okay with that. If I was going to then run tons of jackets, tons of shirts, believe me, I would then edit this thing so that it was more efficient for that material, for that usage, and I would have two versions of it. However, in the way of future-proofing, if I'm starting with caps and caps are the primary type of work I'm going to do, there's a chance that I can run this on a shirt because the sizing wasn't far different enough and didn't cause that much trouble. So in the way of sequencing center out is usually forgivable on flats, whereas sequencing right to left entirely, left to right entirely, depending on your hoop and your cap or your gauge and the way things are framed, may not work well and may cause problems on your caps. That's less forgivable. If you must choose one sequence, you're not going to edit, you're going to have somebody else do the work, and you know you're doing caps that shift, then the likelihood is you'll be better off with a cap design running on a shirt than a shirt design running on a cap. That's just where I've been. That's been my experience of things. I won't say that it's 100% or that there aren't different ways to run things where you can do certain things. I've seen people do the glue down method with hats where they're smashing them flat and they're running left to right, and it's running okay because they're running them pretty much like material with a flat aspect. I don't love it because the distortion of the crown, I think, doesn't always work very well. And some of the stabilizers people use for that have a tendency to tear out if you're doing a really detailed full design before they're done running and you get shifting. However, in this case, running cylindrical cap frames and you're having problems with shifting, you're probably going to be better off using a cap sequence first and running it on flats when you need to. Like I said, ultimately, once you're starting to do hundreds of these things, you don't want to be doing this repeatedly. This is when someone throws in a flat once in a while. Using a cap design is okay. I'll say that is one of those things. So that is not necessarily one of the things that I would say you do every time. I will not digitize everything for caps knowing that caps are coming. However, if I'm not going to use a design very frequently and I know caps are in the running and must be part of the mixture, I'm more likely to, I would say, release myself and allow there to be an inefficient run on the flats than to have the caps run poorly, because we're literally going to be tossing caps out when things don't register correctly. Whereas on the hats, we're losing some time, or on the flats, rather, we're losing some time, and that's it. So that's the thing I'd say about sequencing when we're talking about future-proofing. So in that case, future-proofing, yes, we can do a little bit of future-proofing. Ultimately, it's not all that it's cracked up to be necessarily. And like I said before about execution, guys, this is something that you guys have seen me show this before. When we're talking about scale and execution, anytime you're using manual stitching, outline work, and I know you've seen this design many times, I'll bring up a different black work or engraving style design next time I discuss this, but we make vastly different decisions as to how many lines literally we put together. As you can see, even though I'm just showing it to you, let's say this was the original size we were working at. If I zoom in tighter, everything looks a little too sparse. It doesn't look as good as it could. We end up with things looking chunky, angular, and loose. Whereas if we execute it at half the size, it looks messy, it looks lumpy, and we don't actually see what's going on. So scalability is not very easy to do with heavily detailed designs like this. In the case you were trying to make this more future-proof, the way you would probably do this is to reduce as much detail as you think you have to get close to your bottom size design, the smallest you're going to go, and then limit yourself to how much you are willing to rescale it at a top end in order to make sure you don't end up really sparse. If somebody wants to go from cap to jacket bag, the chances are you're going to have a completely new set. And I'm like, not the chances are. This, if it had to be a jacket back or it had to be a front chest piece instead of a hat, would absolutely have to be redone from scratch, because I would make incredibly different decisions as to how many lines from the original engraving art I was reproducing I put in. There were many more lines on the front of this house than exist here now. There were many more lines and much more curved lines in all of the branches and leaves and things that were in this kind of foliage around the place. They are much straighter, more angular, because I was rendering them in such a small size that the individual stitches had to be long enough to execute well. And you'll notice that things like little stars and little angular sets of stitches can look curved in the final piece when you're zoomed out, when you're at the right size, or they don't look curved when they get larger because you haven't included curves in them. You're using that minimum stitch length to establish how you're drawing. So, like I said, future-proofing, why do I put it in little scare quotes? Well, the chances are that you can't really future-proof. You're not going to make a design that's universal. What you're going to do is aim for a middle texture, something that you know you're going to run. For me, when I did stock designs and anything that I expected to be on different textures, I would aim for, I've said this before, a cotton piqué polo. So it's got a little bit of texture, it's got a little bit of loft, but not a ton, and it would run nicely if a little bit too dense. On things like shirt material, on twills, on poplins, maybe a little too dense, maybe a little too heavy, but they'd run okay. And it would be heavy enough, and it would have enough underlay and protection from texture that it ran okay on sweats and fleeces and things that needed a little bit more. That's the middle target. The thing is, it means it's a little heavy for light materials. It means it might be a little light or require some extra pull compensation to run on very lofty materials. But that's the middle range. The same thing with scale. If I'm looking at something that needs to be a hat and a left chest, I'm going to look at whatever is the limiting factor. On a design that's going to go on a hat, the limiting factor is always the vertical scale. How tall can we make this thing, and what does that do to the rest of the design when I get it down small enough to fit in the limited vertical space I have on the hats I'm going to use? We're going to work at that scale. And what we're going to do is look at it and say, what can I omit to get down to that scale and still have it look decent at that scale? But when I am up to the left chest size, which might be a little larger, I'm definitely going to say, hey, what am I going to get out of that? Is it going to be too sparse, especially if I'm doing manual shading or details? Will it be too sparse? Will it look too loose? Will it not look detailed enough? And I'll make that decision based on that. And then if I'm talking about scaling a design that I already have that I haven't future-proofed, it's the same game. Smallest stitch, smallest gap, largest stitch. What does that do to the design when we scale up or down? It's pretty easy to see what it is. Most of the time, you're going to find that the weak points are similar all the way around. Small text, as it gets smaller, tends to have issues. We have a floor. We have a basement under which we cannot go. We know where that limit is because of our needles and our thread. If we change down to thinner needles, we know we might need some more density. Thinner needles, thinner thread, more density, and we might have some different things to work with as far as texture. We might need to use support materials like toppings. So it really is dependent on that. And if we're working with something that is infinitely scalable, like fonts, and like I said, I've got fonts that I'm working on here, and I'll even show you something I'm working on that you maybe shouldn't see, but hey, why not? We'll talk about some fonts that I've worked on to show you. But the thing is, whenever we're working on fonts, we're going to be looking at things, and here, I'll zoom in tight. Font based on Albertus. It's a lovely Roman kind of flared serif design. And if we're looking at a font like that that's scalable, you're going to see that some of the decisions you make have to do with how we achieve shapes, right? We know we have a tapered stroke here that goes into the M. Well, here's the thing. If I grab this stroke, and let's say I actually grab the stroke itself, and I'm going to go ahead and alter it and talk about it real quick. If we are going to grab this stroke itself, and we're going to work on it, there are two ways I could achieve this taper. I could taper down and have my stitch angle turn and taper. If I taper like this, you can already see I've actually got stitches that are so small they're filtering out. I can't get small enough down to there. At a very large size, that might be okay. At a small size, it won't. Well, how am I going to achieve that taper instead? I'm going to cut off and allow the taper to be the overall shape, including the cut off end of the satin stitch. The way we achieve the shape matters. Same thing with this piece here for Glider, which is the font I'm working on personally. It's just my own project. This piece comes down to a taper, but if you look at the original, it very much could have come down to a rounded end. But that rounded end that's there, that rounding means that if I kept straight across, I would end up with stitch angles that got the stitch lengths that got smaller and smaller toward the tip. And then even at a large size, the smallest stitches that are there are either going to be too small, or through filtering that happens when you save to your machine format, you're going to end up filtering those out and literally cutting the tip off of it anyway, and it looks worse. It doesn't maintain the character of the original text. So for my money, what I'm going to do is change my stitch angles, and I'm going to change the thickness ahead of time, working toward the smallest size. But so the way we arrive at shapes is also part of how we handle it. We draw the shape we need, and the way we arrive at the shapes we need also changes how we can scale. Same thing though, if I was using something like this and I go really large, and you see this in the scalable piece here, the funny thing about it is when I start to go really large, this is actually too long and it looks funny, and the compensation is not nearly what I would want out of it. I don't like it as much at this size, and it makes this end look cut off. It looks cooped. It does not look like the way it should look, whereas it's much more elegant at a larger size to go ahead and maintain your curve. And even if as I was using this as broken up satin stitches, which is much too large for that, I would do better to go ahead and let the stitches actually shorten down into the point once I get to a smaller size, or to that larger size. And I would even say at this scale compared to where I started here, this piece would look better if I had allowed there to be a curve here. The thing is, this is outside of probably the largest way I would want this scalable font to run. This is really pretty big. It's bigger than I would intend to run. And certainly when I'm really planning for these sizes being the primary down here at the bottom end, this is kind of the size I'm expecting people to run with, this as the smallest. Then working toward this size, we're going to have to make some accommodations. So let's go ahead and bring in, we got our last couple comments, and then I think we are going to call it for today. We're not going to go for the 2-hour limit one more time. Let's bring in Justin Armenta, also digitizer, as you know. I think the hardest element to future plan is line detail, 100%. The smaller version may dictate running stitch detail when a larger scale may look better and support satin stitch details. 100%. I mean, this is what I was showing without any compunction. And like I said, I showed you an old design because I don't actually have too many people who want literally the same art on the left chest and the back. In fact, what I'm going to tell you is most of the time when I had somebody who wanted the same art left chest and back, I would tell them either if the back was super detailed, I'm like, let's take an element out of that and make a coordinating left chest that matches the style and has some cues from it, but is not exactly the same. So let's say with this particular piece, let's say it was super detailed. Maybe I would take just the central star out and make something out of it. Maybe I would do a text left chest that said AFRL and had some detail, but didn't have everything. This isn't super detailed, so I didn't have to do that. However, on some things like we would deal with a logo or that had characters or something else, where the jacket back was incredible. It had details or a landscape or something. Where I shrink it down, it looks like hamburger. I would say, okay, we've got this landscape, but it has a character in it. Let's say there's a person who's standing in the landscape. Let's take the bust of the person and make that your left chest with some text. There are sometimes design solutions to these issues. However, when we have designs like this, like I said, there's an older design of mine, and it was one of the few where people just absolutely said, go all the way down to left chest size and hat size and all the way up to full jacket back size. Then we're going to definitely have that kind of choice. And that's exactly what Justin's saying. Here I have straight stitch detail in these stars. These are absolutely made of straight stitches. And when we get into the larger size, they are multiple carved satins with a border. That's the other thing too, is just omitting borders. I flat told these people that no, there will be no borders on that star. By the time that I try and do a bordered look to it, and they were adamant about the yellow star being the primary show there, I said, well, you're going to have one or the other. It's going to look kind of weird. It looks more like stripes. It looks like I'm trying to make something that is not the star when I do it. And they opted for the yellow stars. And I think it was probably the right choice. The other thing you could do is just omit it entirely, depending on what it is. But these are important pieces of the symbology for this patch. So it's something that I didn't really want to do. However, I definitely said, hey, the outlines, this is what it's going to look like. Certainly showing somebody an example of what it looks like where they can kind of get an idea about that. Absolutely the case. But yeah, Justin's completely right. Same thing here with the orchards. If I were going to go much larger, I mean, this text is done in straight stitch text. As I get larger and larger with this straight stitch text, it starts to look chunky and awful and doesn't read very well. Whereas at the original kind of size, it reads pretty well. You can see what it is, and it's enough for you to understand if you knew the place what it is. It's not the primary text. It's not like the name of the business, which would be underneath this logo type, this design, this piece. It's going to just show you that, yes, there's a sign on the building that says orchards, and it just needs to be recognizable. However, if I were going to render this at jacket back size, then yeah, I'd probably make all this satin stitches. Also, all these things would be curves. There wouldn't be these little jaggedy pieces. There'd be many more branches on the trees behind, because as you get close, this looks like nothing. This is mush. because it isn't really meant to have every detail in it. It's meant to intimate the details that are there. Looks good here. We can see things like the weather vane, the panels on the house, the windows. We can see that there's a little screen door here. We can see the basket and the apples and the jug here. But when you get close to them and you don't have enough detail, it just becomes gobbledygook. It doesn't really look like anything, and the angles get horrible. You don't really see anything because the angles don't make sense, and because I've omitted tons of detail that was in the original piece in order to get it to fit down for a cap size. So yeah, Justin is absolutely right. Straight stitch detail does not cooperate with you. So anything engraving style like this, scaling up is going to be an issue, because when you scale up, it looks too sparse, it looks angular, it looks weird. Scaling down is going to be an issue because it gets close together. And as you can see from this, if we just keep going, if we keep going closer together, well, it's going to look mushy and we're just going to have a big blob, because you get to a point where, as we know, 0.4 mils between doubled rows of stitching, that 0.4 mils, that's 4 points of density. That's a full fill. If we scale down too much from where we are here, those lines will be that close together and we'll get a fill with 40 weight thread. We already know what a fill is. A fill is just thread. We know there is only one stitch. There is only one stitch in machine embroidery. It is a point to a point that is on the top of the fabric. It's all we have. Everything else is combination stitches together. What defines them is how long they are, what arrangement they're in, and how close they are together. And we can make a manual stitch into any sort of stitch we have because it's all the same thing. It's all the one stitch. So we know if we're doing straight stitch detail like that, when we get too close together, we make fills. And they make kind of ugly fills most of the time because they don't have nice stitch penetrations that line up the way we want them to. All right, folks. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let that be the end of the take up for today. So the beginning of season 2 is here. There will be more fun stuff to come. I had kind of a really busy week, so hopefully there was still something to learn here that was helpful for you guys. I know, like, we got into fonts pretty deeply here because I know that everybody's still very much about wanting to do font stuff, and we will talk about some font stuff soon. You will see more of that. I think I will do some more in-depth digitizing work with that. So I absolutely talk about scaling, how we render corners, how we deal with overlaps, how we deal with the difference between a scalable native font and what you might do as lettering. So looking forward to that. But certainly if you have other stuff that you want to discuss, please get in the comments. Hit me up on social media. Find me on, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'm on all of these. Or email me at embroideryeric@gmail.com, or leave comments. Like I said, leave comments on any of these videos and let me know. I do check these comments. I don't always answer immediately, but I try and answer if you actually ask me a question. And if you have something you want to see, absolutely let me know. But like I said, I know fonts, because it's coming up so much. Fonts and patches, these are things that I'm going to talk about again. They've been talked about before. Go look at other videos we've done, but we will get more in deep on fonts. It's something that I'm doing a lot of right now too, so it's very topical for me. And we'll definitely talk about the difference between lettering and fonts again, and discuss some things about what's different in executing lettering at a size versus executing a font that is scalable. Okay, with that, guys, I'm super glad you're here, and I really can't wait to see you again next Friday. Keep it together, keep reciprocating, stay strong, and stitch on, and I will see you guys again soon. Now let's go ahead and see that intro one more time.